I'm Thanasi Kambanis. You're listening to the TCF World podcast. Today, we continue a series of conversations in which we explore what a better, smarter, progressive foreign policy could look like. Today, we're going to drill down into the question of Iran, the crisis and risk of war we face today, how better to manage the questions Iran raises in the future, and what a smarter, better United States policy toward Iran could look like. We've got two guests today. We have Ariane Tabatabai, an associate political scientist at the RAND Corporation, joining us on the line from Washington, D.C., and our colleague Dina Sfandiari, a Century Foundation fellow who's calling in from Switzerland. I'm Thanasi Kambanis, and I'm in New York with Michael Wahid Hanna. I want to start today by asking you about the current moment of crisis that we find ourselves in. Why does it seem like every party to the great deal that was negotiated not so long ago with Iran seems today on the precipice of some kind of really destructive escalation with Iran? Dina, can you explain to us what the risks are and why we're at this moment?
I think the biggest risk is obviously a risk of military confrontation. And I think the reason why it's high today is because there no longer exists any channels of de-escalation between Iran and the US like it did under the previous administration. When the when Iran took American sailors, the Foreign Minister Zarif was able to talk directly to Secretary Kerry, and the crisis, a bigger crisis, was averted, and the sailors were released in a relatively quick time frame.
Remind us what year that was, Dina?
2016.
Thank you, Ariane. So those channels of communication no longer exist, which means if there's any mistake or any threat of escalation could potentially get out of control pretty quickly. And why are we here? I think that this is largely due to President Trump's policy of getting rid of the Iran nuclear deal that was signed in 2015. After the U.S. pulled out from the deal, Iran decided to give it a little bit of time to see whether the deal could be implemented by the remaining parties to it. And I think that Tehran lost patience after a year.
Am I right today that the deal is technically still intact, just with the European members to the agreement and Iran, or what?
Well, the only party that has actually stepped away from the deal today is the U.S. So the remaining P4+1 states are still party to the deal. The deal is no longer intact, though, because the U.S. is making its implementation very difficult, and Iran, for its part, has now begun responding by not implementing some of its own commitments.
Ariane, give us a little bit of an overview of the sort of flare points in this crisis. And I mean, I have in mind the tanker episodes in the Gulf and the Iranian vessel with oil impounded in Gibraltar, but you can sort of speak at this at whatever level you want to give us a sense of how dangerous open military conflict is between Iran and other countries today.
Oh, gosh. Yeah. So there's a lot that has happened over the past year. So President Trump withdrew the United States from the nuclear deal on May the 8th, 2018. And as Dina was suggesting earlier on, the Iranians decided that the best approach to it would be to adopt this thing they called the strategic patience policy, which meant that they essentially sat on their hands for a bit and engaged the Europeans and Russia and China as well, but mostly the Europeans, to try to get the sanctions relief that they were promised. And that was increasingly looking like it was not going to happen following the United States withdrawal from the deal. And at the same time, they started to threaten that, they would be taking action if nothing materialized, if they didn't get what they were promised during the nuclear negotiations and as part of the JCPOA. A year essentially passed without too many crises, I should say. The administration here in the United States decided that it was going to draw down the Iranian oil exports to zero in November and essentially started to impose sanctions and reimpose sanctions that were lifted under the nuclear deal as well. And so for a few months, we essentially had a period where every couple of weeks we had new designations, new sanctions kicking in. So the administration was really going out of its way to make sure that Iran was unable to trade and to engage in the global economy. After a year, on May the 8th, 2019, the Iranian president made an announcement where he said that Iran was also going to begin taking a number of steps to essentially scale back its commitments under the nuclear deal and stop their implementation. And it essentially said, look, we are going to start to step away from some of our obligations under the deal. And we're going to engage the Europeans to make sure that they give us what we want, which was, again, sanctions relief, Iranian ability to export its oil. And if they do so, then we will continue to implement the deal. But if they don't, then we will gradually kind of take steps back from the deal. And from there, we have seen a number of mini crises that have essentially erupted throughout the region. Initially, there was Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe went to Iran, was trying to essentially serve as a mediator between the United States and Iran. And when he was in Tehran, essentially meeting with the Supreme Leader and the president, a couple of tankers in the Persian Gulf, or I think in the Strait of Hormuz, were targeted. One of them was a Japanese tanker. And Iran denied, of course, that it had anything to do with it. At this point, the U.S. government, as well as other governments, have said that Iran was behind the attacks. There was also the downing of a drone in the Strait of Hormuz a few weeks ago.
A United States drone.
A U.S. drone, correct?
And this was not a little drone like the ones we're used to seeing in strikes. This was a large surveillance aircraft that was quite complex and expensive, and of which only a small number exist, right?
Yes, and expensive is actually something to highlight because that was one of the major sort of issues in the United States was, this was an expensive drone. We should be retaliating for its downing. So there's been a lot of back and forth about what happened there. The Iranians said that the drone had entered their airspace, and so they shut it down because it's actually a surveillance drone. And so they said that the drone was spying on Iran. The United States, of course, says that the drone was not in Iranian airspace. And so it sort of saw that attack as a provocative action. And so there's been a lot of back and forth there as well about what happened. We came very close to the United States launching a strike on Iran following that incident. President Trump, shortly after, it was leaked that President Trump was going to authorize a strike on Iran, but then he has decided to pull back because, as he put it, there would be too many Iranian casualties, and he didn't want to get to that point.
Dina, tell us under what scenarios we could see the type of escalation we're experiencing now lead to direct conflict. What does a possible war scenario look like?
I think that the main scenario where we would end up with some kind of military confrontation is if a mistake happens or there's some kind of miscalculation by both sides, and one side doesn't understand an action taken by the other, and that leads to conflict.
So, are we talking about hot war in Iraq, in the Gulf, a tanker war? What are the actual scenarios?
Well, the most important point is that there is no likely scenario where a military confrontation will remain limited. If there is any kind of direct attack on Iran, airstrikes, for example, on Iranian nuclear facilities, then Tehran is going to have to respond. Now, Iran is not going to be able to obviously target the U.S. soil, but what it will do is either respond and target U.S. positions in the region, or target U.S. allies and friends in the region. I think what's more likely is that it will use or rely on some of the groups and the proxies that it works with in the region and have them target U.S. positions in the region. And Iran itself will retaliate by striking, for example, at any kind of facility in one of the Gulf Arab states. And in fact, Iran has said that this is what it's likely to do.
So we're talking about Iraqi militias attacking American targets or Hezbollah attacking, and then maybe oil facilities in the Gulf. Does that then lead to Gulf countries and Arab countries also striking back?
I think it would be really difficult for them not to. They would have to defend their own interests, and if Iran carries out strikes on their countries, then they're going to have to retaliate in some way or another. And I think that they are much stronger militarily now than they were perhaps 5, 10, 15 years ago, giving them the option to actually strike back at Iran, which means that the region would effectively be dragged into military confrontation and turmoil for the foreseeable future.
Affecting all the most important oil producers in the world. So that's why we care about this crisis.
Absolutely. I don't think that there is any country in that region that will remain unaffected by military confrontation.
Ariane, just a bit of follow-up, perhaps for those less initiated in the inner workings of the JCPOA, but a question about the European ability to sustain the deal, or the P4+1 ability to sustain the deal without the United States. Why is that so difficult? Why are those countries not able to meet the Iranian expectation about what they would get out of the nuclear deal?
Well, there's a few different things here. I think there's a number of layers. One is that the Europeans have really had decades of following the U.S. lead on a lot of these issues. The United States has traditionally led on non-proliferation and arms control agreements, and the Europeans have sort of followed. And so this is really one of the first times when they have been tested as a leader in this context. And so it's a bit of a learning curve for them to step up. The second issue is that they have their own interests, which are, on the one hand, to continue cooperating with the United States. They may not like a lot of this administration's policies, but they have to live with them. And ultimately, the relationship with the United States on a security, military, political, and economic level is much more existential. It's much more important to EU and EU member states' interests than the relationship with Iran. So they're finding themselves in this place where they want to preserve the JCPOA. They see it as very important to their own security and on some level to their economic abilities to work with Iran. But they also don't want to and cannot afford to lose the United States as their greatest ally, essentially. There's also the U.S. economic reach. For better or worse, the United States has this incredible is an incredible economic powerhouse, and so it is able to actually get states to do what it wants through economic means in ways that other countries cannot.
So just to end this section of our conversation, I want to ask you, you went over some of the details of all the points of tension, and I want to ask, because this is a question in a lot of people's mind, sort of whose fault is it? And how much should we understand this as being sort of poor Iran backed into a corner by Trump's sort of aggressive moves? How much of this should we understand as Iran being a bad faith spoiler actor in the region? And if you could each, Dina first, take like 1 minute to give us that analysis before we move on to the next section.
I think on this particular issue, it was clearly the United States' fault. Now, that's not to say that Iran is not a nefarious actor in the region and doesn't have problematic policies. For sure it does. But on this particular issue, Iran continued to implement the deal. The IAEA, the organization charged with checking the implementation of the deal, has now confirmed, I think, 15 times that Iran was implementing the deal. So the nuclear deal was doing exactly what it said on the cover. It was constraining Iran's nuclear program. Today, Iran's nuclear program is not being constrained as effectively because the United States walked away from the deal and is effectively trying to prevent the remaining countries party to the deal from implementing what's left of the agreement. And so the deal didn't target Iran's regional activities. It didn't target Iran's missile program. It targeted its nuclear program. And in that respect, it was working.
Yeah, I largely agree. I think that a year ago, the Europeans presented President Trump with the opportunity to keep the JCPOA and to build on it and to address areas of concern that are shared between the United States and the Europeans, including Iran's missile program, including regional activities. And the administration essentially said, no, we're going to walk away from the deal and we want a big for big sort of deal. And we will get that without the JCPOA serving as its basis. And I think that was a missed opportunity that really would have allowed the United States to work with its allies, to build on the agreement, and to get all of the different areas of Iranian behavior that it wanted under check. That said, I think in more recent weeks, what we've seen, the downing of the drone, the tanker issue, I think all of that is on Iran. It is trying to raise the costs of this maximum pressure campaign that the administration has started, and to raise it not just on the US, but also on the EU. So I think a lot of it does go back to the U.S. withdrawal from the deal, but I think that we also have to allocate blame where appropriate on the more recent actions to Iran.
We'll be right back.
I'm Abir Pamuk, and I am a summer scholar at the Century Foundation. I am a nonprofit professional from Aleppo, and I worked in Syria during the war delivering humanitarian aid to children. Now I'm finishing my studies and beginning a new career as a foreign policy analyst. Here at the Century Foundation, I am researching non-state actors and U.S. policy in the Middle East. You can see all our projects on the Century Foundation's website, tcf.org, in the World section.
I'm Thanasi Kambanis. You're listening to the TCF World podcast. I'm here in New York with Michael Wahid Hanna, and we've got Ariane Tabatabai and Dina Esfandiari on the line with us. Thanks for joining. We want to turn now to the deal itself, the JCPOA, which one of you will give us its full proper name in a second. And I want to start with this idea that's been put on the table, and I'm just not sure how realistic it is. A lot of supporters of the deal, including presidential candidates, but also all kinds of analysts, say the position of the U.S. should be to reenter the deal. Either Trump could do it, or we could wait until after Trump is gone. And I want to ask you. Is that even possible? How would that work if the U.S. were to raise its hand today or in 2022 and say, "Hey, we'd like to come back to this thing"?
So ideally, yes, it would be possible for the U.S. to simply walk back into the deal, and everything would go back to normal in terms of the implementation of the deal and Iran's nuclear, commitments, and then based on that. The countries concerned would then be able to expand discussions to other areas of concern, including what Iran is doing in the region and its missile program, for example. Unfortunately, I don't think that is likely or even possible. While some of the Democratic candidates have said they would rejoin the deal, and I think that many of those who worked on the deal or helped negotiate it welcome that kind of move. I firstly don't think it would be possible, although the deal doesn't mention anything in terms of exiting and getting back into it. And actually, the Iranians, interestingly enough, do not simply want the United States to rejoin the deal, because they now say that being a party to the deal is a privilege, because it gives you access to mechanisms such as the dispute resolution mechanism, and that would effectively lead to, the ability to call on the international community to punish Iran. And Iran doesn't want the U.S. to have access to that. So what Iran has asked for is for the U.S. to declare that it is committed to the deal without rejoining it, and then implement its end of the bargain, which is to ensure that Iran would be able to, increase trade with Europe, to sell its oil, etc. So that, from Iran's perspective, that's the ideal scenario.
Ariane?
Yeah, so I think, there's a number of challenges going forward with reentering the deal. And, I think that there's a bit of a recognition of it. Slowly but surely, people are starting to recognize that 2015 and 2021 are not, it's not the same time frame. It's we've now have had multiple crises that we didn't have in the lead to the JCPOA. And I think there's a number of things. One is that politically, it may not be as easily feasible for the United States to re-enter the deal. There's going to be a lot of pushback at home. And the same thing can be true of Iran. Right after the new administration or the existing administration continues its second term or takes office, the Iranians are going to have elections, presidential elections. And Rouhani can't run again. He has served his or he would have served his 2 terms by then that are allowed under the Iranian constitution. And so he will only have about 6 months to figure out what to do with the JCPOA. I'm sure he would like to preserve it. It's his sort of flagship policy achievement. But at the same time, he's domestically going to see a lot of pressure if he simply essentially returned to, Iran simply started to implement its end of the bargain again. Without anything more coming from the United States, without any more concessions, essentially, or benefits.
And Ariane, with the moves that Iran has taken in the last few months to start distancing itself from some of its commitments under the JCPOA, will there even be, forget about at the end of Trump's term, in 6 months' time or a year's time, will there even be a deal to return to?
Yeah, and that's a fundamental question. I'm not sure that the deal will still be there by then. I think that there are certainly people in Iran as well as here who would like to see the deal sustained until January 2021. But whether or not that's possible is an entirely different question. Iran is already, as Dina was mentioning earlier on, is already taking steps in violation of the deal and scaling those activities back, even though it says that it would like to do that once the Europeans give it the benefit at once, is not going to be as simple. Technically, those steps are reversible, but politically, it's a lot harder to go back into full implementation of the deal for Iran. So I think that is one major question that needs to be addressed. There's also the issue of what has happened since outside of the JCPOA, which will affect the JCPOA in 2021, including the crises, of the past few weeks, but also the regional aspects of Iran's activities. It's a lot harder today to distinguish and to decouple the nuclear file from the regional file as it was in 2015 when Iran wasn't where it is today.
It's an interesting thing to think about. When Obama's team was negotiating this deal, they very consciously set aside other issues and said, we're going to focus on this one priority. And then afterwards, we can talk about Iraq or Syria or Yemen or rockets. But looking at the region today where, there's plenty of bad actors, and I don't single out Iran alone, but Iran has a lot of culpability on its hands from signally its destabilizing moves in Syria and its approach to Iraq and its role in the Yemen war. All of these things are just those 3 alone are major, serious issues, and it's very hard from the perspective of someone who supported the deal and who supports de-escalation and in general avoiding the prospect of war with Iran, at the same time to say, geez, Iran's doing a lot of really problematic, troubling things, and we can't just say the only thing that matters here is the nuclear program.
Can I add to that? I think that the other problem is that actually Iran and the U.S. have made it difficult to decouple it because they have brought in the regional context, their relationship, and a range of other issues into at the forefront of dealing with the nuclear deal itself. When Iran targets tankers from neighboring countries in the region, then it makes it, in retaliation for the U.S. walking away from the deal and for implementing additional sanctions, it naturally links the two together, which is why it makes it really difficult for Iran's neighbors to then completely ignore that. When the U.S. threatens Iran with military action as a result of shooting down a drone, for example, inevitably the fallout from such military action would affect the region much more. And in fact, I think Iran has made it clear that it if such action was to be taken against it, then it would retaliate. It could not retaliate on US soil, so it would have to retaliate in the region. And that, of course, ties those two issues much more together.
And this is a fundamental question of how to analyze the situation. You look at the escalation ladder, and there are hawks in the U.S. who seem to believe that the more they back Iran into a corner, the more likely they are to get Iran to give things up, and that in any case, they don't expect the U.S. to pay a strategic price. The other perspective, which I hold, is that in a escalation and an increasing conflagration, the region suffers, and ultimately U.S. interests suffer more than Iran. But I'm curious, as Ariane and then Dina, how you see that escalation ladder playing out to the benefit or detriment of either side.
Yeah, I mean, I think, the maximum pressure campaign has essentially shown that this is that this narrative that if we back a country into a corner and just seek capitulation by that country, then, we're demonstrating strength and we're meeting U.S. National interests and objectives. That's a fallacy. The maximum pressure campaign, including the designation of the IRGC as a foreign terrorist organization, has shown that, this sort of symbolic muscle flexing is not going to get Iran to actually dial down its nefarious activities. It's going to dial them up. The more it sees itself backed into a corner, the more it's going to lash out, as we have seen over the past few weeks. So I think there's, the idea that by showing force, we can get a country to completely change its mindset, to stop thinking about its national security interests and objectives the way it has been doing for decades is just completely wrong. And I think that it stems in part from the fact that we understand Iranian national interests fundamentally differently from the way they understand their national interests. And we think that they should be thinking the way we do about it. But obviously, that's not possible. Iran does do a lot of terrible things in the region. Its policies in Syria have been largely devastating and destructive, but they're different from the way Iran behaves in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And we tend to not decouple these different theaters and these different areas of interest that Iran has. And some of them, its security objectives are and concerns are more legitimate. And in others, it's really just an opportunistic player. Dina and I have written about this, actually wrote about this many years ago, when Iran started to support the Houthis in the current conflict. We said, Yemen is very different from Iraq for Iran. It's really just using its influence there to back the Saudis into a corner and to deny them a victory. And I think that's largely true still today. In fact, probably more true than it was then. But we have to understand these different sets of concerns and objectives and respond to them accordingly, as opposed to a blanket sort of pressure campaign that doesn't serve U.S. interests.
Yeah, I broadly agree with what Ariane has said. I would actually just add to that a pretty simple exercise. If we put ourselves in the shoes of Iranian policymakers in Tehran, and you're trying to figure out what to do next, well, it's pretty simple. If you abide by Pompeo's 12-point plan, then you're effectively capitulating to the US. So that might be good short term because it means you might be able to negotiate something else and get more for it. But of course, what it means is that you've capitulated to the US, which means at any other time in the future where you have a similar situation and the US wants something from you, the lesson they will have taken away from it, as well as everybody else in the international community, is that if you put enough pressure on Tehran, then they'll cave. So naturally, Iran can't do that, which is why this policy won't work.
On this point, we know what the stated purpose of this maximum pressure campaign is on the part of the United States. Is Iran's posture here simply defensive, reactionary? What's their theory of the case? How are their actions now furthering their interests?
Actually, I would differ slightly with what you've said. I don't think that the stated policy of the maximum pressure campaign is that clear. Nobody has made it clear. Some people say it's a return to negotiations. Others have made it clear that it's to increase pressure on Iran and to squeeze it through the sanctions. Again, to what effect, we don't know. Others seem to want regime change in Iran. And so again, if you're sitting in Tehran, you're looking at this, it's unclear what the other side wants you to do. If it's just a return to the negotiation table, then I guess you could try to take that on politically, despite the fact that internally it would be pretty devastating. But if you took that on, then you don't know what you're getting into. You don't know what the other side wants to negotiate with you, because you already negotiated on the nuclear deal and they walked away from it and you didn't get anything for it. So how much more are you going to have to give up, and how much less are you going to get in return? So again, from Tehran's perspective, the objective of the maximum pressure campaign doesn't seem to be very clear. In terms of what Iran is doing, again, from their perspective, the strategy seems to be pretty clear. The US walked away from the deal. We're going to give the remaining states party a certain amount of time to implement the deal and see if we can continue to salvage what's left of it. The Iranians lasted about a year. And when the US maximum pressure campaign increased in speed and in pressure, beginning in early May, then Iran started to consider what it would have to do in return. And so again, from its perspective, it waited, it was patient, nothing happened, the pressure increased, so now it has to respond in order to show the Europeans and Russia and China, the remaining states party to the deal, that it's serious about downgrading its commitments to the deal and no longer implementing parts of it. Tehran thinks that by doing that, it will be able to get something in return.
We'll be right back.
At a time when the focus of politics is on being the loudest voiced and not the most informed, the Century Foundation delivers thoughtful, evidence-based policy leadership with purpose. And we've had a lot of practice at it, 100 years in fact. I'm Michael Wahid Hanna, and I work on U.S. foreign policy and Middle Eastern politics, carrying on a tradition that TCF's founder began in 1919. Our approach is simple. We sweat the details, doing the hard work today to ensure policy progress tomorrow. In the century ahead, we'll continue to prioritize rigor over reactivity, elevate the best ideas and most diverse voices, and never lose sight of what it takes to make an impact. If you want to help write the progressive headlines of tomorrow, support us today.
This is the TCF World podcast. I'm Thanasi Kambanis here in New York with Michael Wahid Hanna, joined on the line by Ariane Tabatabai from Washington and Dina Sfandiari in Switzerland. We're talking about Iran, the crisis with the U.S. and the rest of the world, and what could happen next, how it could be better. So in this last segment of the conversation, I want to ask our guests to turn toward that future, and the future could be now or the future could be 2021. But I want you to sketch out for us what given where we are now, what a smarter U.S. policy could look like. What's actually possible and plausible, what's desirable, what could America do right with Iran?
The first step is to try to demystify Iran. We tend to again, try to couple all of Iran's activities under this sort of banner of nefarious Iranian behavior. And there is a lot of that, but there is also areas where Iran just cannot stop the way it's doing things. It cannot change its current behavior because that's what its actual national security interests dictate. And if you look back to decades of Iranian foreign policy, and decision-making going back to before the revolution, it becomes more apparent where those areas are, right? In Afghanistan and Iraq, Iran has a number of legitimate concerns, and it's pursuing those. In other theaters, it is really just opportunistically trying to leverage chaos and a lack of opportunity and conflict to its own advantage. And so the first step is to kind of try to decouple all of this and understand where Iran's legitimate concerns are, where we may not be able to get Iran to take a step back from what it's currently doing, and where, we really need them to actually scale back their activity. The second thing is that I think this administration specifically has focused largely on sanctions as the only tool of foreign policy vis-a-vis Iran, and potentially other countries, but we're focusing on Iran here. A better way to look at and think about getting Iran to essentially change its behavior would be to think about other tools that we have at our disposal. And you have to use all these different mechanisms at the same time and in a smart way in order to get the objectives and the outcomes that you want.
What are those better or other tools in addition to sanctions or the threat of violence, which is another one that's often on the table, it seems?
Yeah, well, so you have a range, right? You have diplomacy, you have multilateral diplomacy, you have bilateral diplomacy, you have obviously sanctions, political pressure, just sort of simple naming and shaming, all the way to military threats. So there's a range of tools that are available to the United States. We just seem to be picking one or two right now and focusing on those, and then ignoring everything else.
So I want to put something out there, which I think is important as we think about how to do this better. A sad lesson that I take from the years during which the deal was being negotiated is that acting like a patient realist in good faith with Iran doesn't pay off as well as it should. So I believed, or I found convincing the Obama administration rationale that essentially Iran does have a sphere of influence and the U.S. shouldn't contest every single foothold that Iran has. Some of the things you just mentioned, Ariane, Iran's interests in Iraq and Afghanistan, and that in general, even if there are things we don't like, we have to acknowledge reality, and Iran has a certain amount of power, and we can't just fight everything they have and everything they do. And I think a bitter lesson one can take from those years pre-Trump is that when Iran was given a lot of breathing room on these other issues, it ramped up its spoiler-like behavior in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Yemen, and it did not act like a regional power that was being treated with respect and toleration by the United States. And that I find dismaying because I've always argued, if the U.S. just acts more respectful of these troubling but actors that have some legitimacy nonetheless, that those actors will then behave in a more responsible way. And I don't think that's how it played out. And I think that's a tough lesson to take, because right now Trump is sort of taking the worst possible actions in a lot of these conversations. So it's easy to say, like, what should we do? Well, not that, because that's like, maximum pressure, the worst possible approach. Okay, great. That's the worst possible approach. What's a good approach, given that we had what seemed like a good approach and it didn't yield dividends?
And let me just add one little bit to that, and that is, if Iran sees the end point of all this as they're becoming the regional hegemon with a diminished American role, if that's the end goal of all this, is there really a way to negotiate positive outcomes at a kind of smaller or more tactical level? If those are the stated aims, and maybe those aren't the stated aims, but it seems as if that's the desired endpoint from my perspective.
I think from Tehran's perspective, that endpoint, while perhaps desired, I think they're also very much aware that it's not likely to happen anytime soon. I think it's normal that any country would want to be a regional powerhouse and hegemon. And I think there are a number of others in the region that feel the same way. So, of course, Iran wants it. I don't think that disqualifies it from being somebody that the West and the U.S. can negotiate with, because Iran knows that it faces a number of other adversaries in the region that are significant, to put it mildly. So the U.S., Saudi Arabia, today the UAE, and that's just in the Persian Gulf region. So it's not even going beyond that. So I don't think that disqualifies Iran from having negotiations with the others. In terms of what would be a desirable way forward, I think that actually negotiations and dialogue have proved to us that actually they've been quite effective. Now, granted, Iran's activities in the region did not improve. I totally agree on that front. But the one thing that the agreement targeted did work. Iran's activities on the nuclear front were constrained. And so clearly, dialogue with Iran does lead to desirable outcomes. It's just painful and it takes a long time, but ultimately it worked. And so I think that if the US were to set up a scenario like the Europeans did, where right after the deal, they set up a high-level political dialogue with Iran to discuss a range of issues from, discussing problematic aspects of Iranian policy like human rights in Iran and its regional activities, to more positive things like trade with Iran and educational exchanges with Iran. I think that kind of dialogue and just being face to face would be really, really useful for U.S. policy. I also think that they should set up channels of de-escalation, much like the U.S. and the Iranian Navy have in the Persian Gulf, but that should be expanded to include a range of other areas of operation.
So is our next talks with Iran, whenever they come, are they going to have to be much less ambitious than the talks that led to the JCPOA? Are they going to be about creating red lines and these kinds of de-escalation channels rather than about more broadly ambitious things like calming down the regional competition between the UAE, Saudi on one hand and Iran on the other, and normalizing with the US and Europe?
Normalizing with the US is probably not going to be top of the agenda anytime soon, largely because it's not desirable from a domestic perspective in Iran, but in the US as well. But I actually don't think it should be less ambitious than the nuclear deal. I think it should be equally ambitious, the nuclear deal, as long as it dialogue with Iran covers particular areas of interest. I think that you can have dialogue on a range of issues in parallel to one another. And things that are particularly problematic, like, for example, the range of Iranian missiles, you could have more technical discussions on that and hopefully come to an agreement. The problem today is that after the U.S. walked away from the deal, it has a credibility problem vis-a-vis Iran. And so in my opinion, this kind of dialogue...
Not just vis-a-vis Iran, by the way. This has got a credibility problem worldwide, Paris Accords and many other things.
Yeah, absolutely. And while Iran could have entertained the possibility of having a more widespread dialogue with the U.S. on a range of issues right after the deal, or at least once the deal was implemented and it looked like it was going to be possible to continue discussions, today it's a lot more difficult. And this is where the discussion about whether the U.S. re-entering the deal is possible or worth it or will help offset that credibility issue or not.
Ariane?
Well, I do. I mean, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I do think, though, that Iran inevitably will have to engage with the United States if it wants to come out of the situation it is in currently, which, I don't see as sustainable. Iran may be able to kind of get itself to 2021, but should President Trump get a second term in office, or even if he's replaced by a different administration, Iran will have to inevitably engage on a range of issues. And here's the thing. The thing is that, the 12 points that Secretary Pompeo laid out are very specific to this administration. But the general points, the general ideas behind them are actually shared by both Republicans and Democrats, with maybe a few exceptions here and there. So Iran's ballistic missile program, support for terrorist groups, regional interventions, and human rights, which is not actually explicitly laid out in the 12 points, all of them are things that both sides of the aisle see as challenging for U.S. interests and that they take issue with when it comes to Iran. So if Iran wants to get sanctions relief, if it wants to improve its economy, I think that inevitably we will see negotiations on some of those, if not all of those points.
What does that negotiation look like? I mean, this is obviously speculative. It's probably looking, in some ways unrealistically too far into the future. But as Thanasi mentioned, the sort of disappointment with what the JCPOA produced. What is a realistic? What are the realistic topics of conversation? You've both mentioned ballistic missiles. But there was no budge on Yemen. What does an agenda look like that one could imagine producing at least incremental results?
Well, I think if we're looking at the regional, I think we need to kind of separate these different issues in terms of negotiations. If we were talking about the regional portfolio, I don't see a sustainable process in which the regional players are not involved. In other words, I don't think you can just have the US and Iran sitting across the table and dividing up the region without any input from Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and potentially Israel and others. So whether they're directly involved, as I think the Persian Gulf countries would have to be, or if they're indirectly involved, as I'm assuming Israel would have to be, you have to have some sort of regional process. And the US and the EU would play a role in that, but it's not realistic to exclude them entirely. That was already a sore point in the JCPOA talks, and that was on Iran's nuclear program. On the missile front, I think that any kind of engagement would obviously have the EU more at the forefront than some of the other countries. They have more credibility on this. The range of Iranian missiles specifically is a big concern for them. But I think that whether or not they take place at the same time, or if they sort of happen in an incremental way has to be determined down the line. But I simply don't see a world in which we have several years of negotiations on one topic, as we did with the JCPOA, and then say, okay, and then we will consider other things. I think that you will have to have a broader engagement in order for a single area to be sort of a attainable process in the future.
So we're talking about a next chapter in which we're in a worse position than we were in 2008, and we try to maybe regain some of the successes of this nuclear deal, and then if we can revive them, and then go from there to some of these other equally important security concerns. That's all the time we have. I really appreciate you joining us. Thanks to Ariane Tabatabai, Associate Political Scientist at RAND Corporation, who joined us from Washington, D.C., and Dina Sfandiari, a fellow at the Century Foundation, who joined us from Switzerland. I'm Thanasi Kambanis here in New York with Michael Wahid Hanna. You've been listening to the TCF World podcast, and we'll look forward to having you join us next time. TCF World has been brought to you by the Century Foundation, a progressive public policy think tank that seeks to foster opportunity, reduce inequality, and promote security at home and abroad. For more information about our work, please visit tcf.org or follow us on Twitter and Facebook.